Hey, welcome to Modern Day Debate. Very excited to have you here. We are going to have a unique feature tonight. So we are basically doing In the Lion's Den. This is going to be Jonathan Sheffield debating three lions, three atheists, and we got the heart of a lion, each and every one of them. We're excited for this, as this is going to be fierce and fantastic. We're going to start with just some introductions so you guys can get to know the debaters. I'm really glad that we got this unique mix of people with different backgrounds and ideas together. And so as we do this 3-on-1, just intense battle royale, I'm going to give a quick introduction to each of the debaters so they can share about themselves, their channel, what they're doing at their channel. All of their links are in the description, and I highly encourage you to subscribe to their channel. Even if you don't agree, well, at least you finally understand from their very point of view, their perspective. And so even if you don't agree, hey, what's the worst that happens? You get the most charitable view by listening to them themselves explain it rather than a paraphrase or something like that. So without any further ado, we will start with our three lions, and then we will introduce Jonathan. So first, Red, very glad to have you here. I want everybody to know that Red has his Twitter link down in the description, as well as his Twitter handle. Red, thanks for coming on. What have you been interested in lately?
Me, been busy working on some stuff for my YouTube channel. So there should be some stuff coming here after the first of the year. But yeah, so I'm working on that.
That's awesome, Red. We're glad you're here. And next, we will go to Patient Beard, as we're going to move through these intros quick to jump right into it. Patient, thanks for coming on here. Glad to have you. And if you would like to share about what you've been interested in lately.
Well, my name is Jared, and I run, I go by the moniker Patient Beard, and I really have been neglecting my poor little channel for my day job. But one of these days, I'll try to get some actual content up on it. And one of my other hobbies on the side is I'm making a game, so there's that.
Radical. Well, we're glad you're here again, Jared, so thank you very much. Next, we're going to Christopher with Biblical History Skeptics. Very glad to have you here. And Christopher has his link down in the description for Biblical History Skeptics. Even if you're a Christian, hey, at least you understand the other side if you go to his channel. So as mentioned, please go to all the channels and links below. Christopher, if you want to just share what you've been up to at your channel, we're glad you're here.
Well, first, one note. I am a Steve McRae agnostic. This is the special thing. Anyone on Twitter knows that I just like feeding Steve now. But on my channel, basically what we're doing is we're currently going through two books of the Bible at the moment. We're going through Genesis and we're going through the book of Job. The book of Job is my particular forte right now. But we're basically going through and looking at what scholarship has to say on these two books, look at the textual history of the books, and also goofing off. We usually have some liquor at hand every day. So
I hear ya. Well, everybody likes a good glass of liquor while they're getting their debate on, or their study on. So we're glad to have you here as well, Christopher. Thank you. And we also have our Daniel for the night. So Daniel, who will be in the Lion's Den defending his video, which we're going to show you thanks to Christopher. Christopher is a tech guru. He found a way such that we can actually show you the 5 or 6 minute video from Jonathan. So you will get to see his video that he's going to defend tonight. And then we will let the lions loose, and it will be a battle. So just want to say thank you to Christopher for figuring out how to do that. And Jonathan, thank you so much for coming on and getting in the hot seat, being willing to do this challenging job tonight. So what have you been doing at your channel?
Okay, well, my name is Jonathan Sheffield. I'm a member of the Anglican Communion. Over the last 2 years, I've been creating video animations explaining how we got the books of the New Testament. Currently, right now, I'm in a formal debate with Dr. Richard Carrier on richardcarrier.info on his blog. We're actually discussing the long ending of Mark, whether it's original or was it interpolated into the Gospels? And we're about 2.5, 3 weeks into the debate, and we'll be going through the end of January on there.
Radical. Well, we're glad you're here, and so we're excited about your project. And again, that's linked down in the description, so you can check out Jonathan's channel. And the video that we're about to watch is also down in the description. And that way, if you want to rewatch it after we watch it right now, you can do that. We're showing it so that right now you can, in live time, know what we are debating, in particular the video that Jonathan is defending. So, Christopher, if you are ready, we are ready to show the video. And then I would just ask all the debaters if you could mute your microphone while we watch the video, just in case there's no interference. I'm not sure if it's possible, but just to be sure that everybody at home watching can hear the video. This is definitely, by the way, it's not a dry video. It's very interesting, and it's very, you could say it's got some style. So with that, Christopher, you can let me know when you're ready, and that way I don't rush you, buddy. I think he's ready. So with that, Christopher, I'm turning it over to you, and I'm going to mute everybody else. So 3, 2, 1.
My goodness. Well, hello. It's extremely nice to meet you all. My name is Master Jonathan Sheffield, and this is Chris with Urban Apologetics, and we are looking for a man called Dr. Sam Harris.
No man here carries with him a label.
What? Oh, yes. No names. How silly of me. Well, he is an American.
We are all children of the same life force.
Yes, of course we are. Well, he meditates to the great big nothing in the sky.
Oh, him.
We have traveled all this way to present a coin for him to solve.
Wait right here while I summon him. Pardon my interruption, as I can see you are continuing your search for the Great Void or something. A visitor by the name of Jonathan Sheffield of the Autodidact and Urban Apologetics is here at the temple. Apparently, you have ignored Jonathan's previous attempts to contact you. Now, he is here with a koan for you to solve. Master Sheffield, the Autodidact, has already took on Dr. Ehrman on his blog, and now he is here for you.
Take me to them.
Let the reading of the koan begin.
Yo, Chris, give me a beat. So Dr. Sam Harris, you gonna have me believe the 4 Gospels are like Harry Potter, a book of myths and fairy tales, huh? Well, here's a little challenge I have for you today. You ready? Let's go. Okay, Dr. Sam Harris, I really wish you well, but I have to disagree with the opinions that you tell. Said the Gospels are tabloids, reports on fake news. This ain't Harry Potter, bro, I think that you're confused. You say the Gospel records are just a silly myth. Why not duplicate their revolution with your own script? Let's begin your challenge. Non-fiction is the category. Could you write 4 books, break it down and tell a story? Let's make it interesting, create an imaginary person who had 12 homies and was born of a virgin. That's real, but let's not get absurd. Please reference real cities and events that occurred. Have them preaching name towns, places that exist, to give it validity and make it seem legit. Has to be believable with stories that can be verified. Talking about a real savior who was crucified on the cross in a cruel way and came back from the dead on the 3rd day. They convinced most of the world that it's true, backing it up with evidence that's so hard to refute. Yeah, writing 4 books in the major languages: Greek, Coptic, Veddish, Latin, even Aramaic. Then setting up historic churches across the Mediterranean. I hope you're listening to exactly what I'm saying now. It should be less difficult to do, cause the Romans used torture when they wanted the truth. So let's see if you can prove your fantasy of a hoax. I just wanna know, tell me how it's gonna go. The power of the Roman Empire couldn't disprove one thing of the 4 Gospels to refute, no denying it. Check the info that I'm providing and tell me why have they found and dug the bones of Caiaphas. Yes, Caiaphas the high priest, can't forget him. But what about the bones of Jesus? He is risen. Yeah, I know that you are skeptical. You're an intellect, sharing all your meaningful messages on the internet. But empirical evidence, well, you can take a look. You can see the Bible, it is not like a Harry Potter book. Yeah, meditate on this coin while you're praying to the great nothing in the sky. I'll be waiting for your reply. Zen Master out. Yeah.
Jarvis, what do you make of this koan?
All right, thank you very much. And I am excited, Jonathan. That is an interesting video. I've never seen anything like it, and very entertaining, and also putting your argument in the video. And so you had mentioned earlier that you wanted to take a minute to just kind of explain the main thrust that you're getting at in the video. So we want to give you a minute to do that. And then what we'll do is we will let the lions loose. So thank you very much, Jonathan, and the floor is yours in terms of giving us, like I said, the main thrust from your video.
Things. First, you know, the purpose of the video was to first open up a dialogue with atheists. In doing so, I want to explain a couple of things when we talk about Christianity, especially this historical event. What Christianity differs from other religions is we provide a theory, or at least a position, that can be falsifiable. So when we take a look at Karl Popper's maxim, for a theory to be scientific, it must be falsifiable. Unlike other religions that we can get to, they don't give us anything that we can actually falsify. With Christianity, we can. So either, you know, we can produce the body, which would hence falsify Christianity, or we can produce a credible tome from the ancient world explaining exactly what had happened. Or for those that don't believe in that Christ existed, all we would have to do is produce who created the myth. The first century is a well-documented time We obviously understand who wrote the Aeneid. We know a great deal about the context and formation of the Aeneid. We know who Virgil was. We have a great deal of information about him. And in regards to Christianity, we have a lot of information regarding that too. So the question is, we had the ruling powers of the Roman Empire. We had the Pharisees. We had great historians at that time. So what I'm presenting in the challenge is a way to falsify Christianity. The one thing I really enjoyed about James Randi was he actually went out to the psychic world and took a very investigative approach to falsifying the claims of many psychics out there. He took a very scientific approach to what he did. And so what I'm posing to modern atheists is a very similar challenge in which Christianity could be falsified. And then from here, I'll just open it up to questions from the panel.
So I've got one.
The lions are loose. Go ahead, Christopher. Glad to hear your question. Go ahead.
Okay. So you say that the first century is very well documented. Could you name me 3 historians of ancient Judea?
Well, we have Josephus, which is really interesting about Josephus is he was a hostage under the Flavian emperors. And even though he writes a great deal on the Jewish wars, he does give a little background on Christianity, and whether certain of his statements are alleged to be forgeries or not reliable. What we don't have from Josephus is a tome refuting Christianity. And if you think about it, being a hostage to Rome, I mean, he was a great historian. He had a lot of assets at his disposal, but not one tome does he write against refuting Christianity. And he was in a position to do so. Apart from Josephus, we do have Philo, but if you think about it, we also have Pliny the Younger, who did interact with Christianity. Now, he was a high Roman official. And we have Tacitus as well. So we're talking about high officials in the Roman Empire. We're not talking about modern people. I mean, just look at, for example, Lucretius. In the 1st century, he's writing on the nature of things. Now, the interesting thing about Lucretius is he was an Epicurean. So he kind of almost represents almost a modern day atheist. So this kind of represented it kind of illustrates the Roman nobility at that time on how they thought. So we're not dealing with an uneducated class of individuals. We're dealing with high officials in the Roman Empire. Even Josephus, who were in a position to actually counter the claims of Christianity. We have information from Tacitus in the 1st century as well, who writes about Christians. But what we don't have is any tome from Tacitus, Josephus, Pliny the Elder, refuting what the Christians said.
Right. So of those, the only ones that are actually historians of ancient Judea, though, would be Philo and Josephus. Tacitus.
Correct.
Yeah. So we only actually have 2. So it's not actually that well documented for the 1st century. But like when you compare it to the annals of Roman history, we have Suetonius, Dionysius, Diogenes. We have just innumerable historians recording Roman history and Greek history. But Judea is special in the 1st century in that it is almost not talked about at all.
Yeah, but Tacitus, who was a high Roman official and prosecutor under Domitian, not only writes about the Christians, but he was in a position of power that had official records that would have been able to refute Christianity.
Right.
I don't mean to interrupt.
I completely agree with that. I'm not saying anything about the reputation. I was just wondering why you said that it's really well documented. I mean, outside of Judea, in Rome, it's pretty well documented, but in the province of Judea, it's rather poorly attested.
Christianity spread throughout the Roman Empire. So, I mean, we're talking about Rome. We're talking, in North Africa. We're talking about Gaul, and we're talking about the Roman Empire was in control of these areas. So obviously, Joseph, when we talk about who would have been in a position to counter the claims that are made in the Gospels, it would have been the high officials of the Roman Empire. And I think what we can show documented throughout is that the Roman Empire was very interested in Christianity by the way they were going about their investigation of not only with Jesus, but with Paul as well. I mean, Paul meets with very high officials in the Roman Empire, and we can actually document the same type of investigation that the Romans were able to conduct. Livy actually provides a great account of the Bacchus cult that the official Roman Empire went out to investigate because of the concerns with that group. And we see the same investigation occurring with Jesus. And the question is if Festus, if Felix, if the grandson of Herod the Great, we got Pilate going out doing official investigations, where are the acts of that investigation? And it's interesting to note that both Justin Martyr in the 2nd century, also Tertullian from North Carthage, Africa, call out the Roman governor to actually release the official acts of Pilate, which would have prevented them an opportunity to refute what the Christians were saying.
The issue I see with that, though, is that I don't actually see the Roman historians as actually that interested, at least at first, with Christianity. If you read Pliny the Younger, I mean, when you look at the replies he got from the emperor, it was basically, well, if they actually say they're Christian, then persecute them, but otherwise don't go seeking them out or anything. I mean, he wasn't even that interested at all in them. Tacitus becomes a little bit more interested, but only in just calling them a cult and nothing more, and just saying that their leader was crucified. Beyond that, he doesn't care to investigate any further.
Well, but we do have officials of the Roman government investigating Paul. So we have Felix, who was the brother of Seneca at the time. I mean, you have Festus. So you have high officials of the Roman Empire taking a very serious interest in Christianity. They did this with the Bacchus cult as well. Livy gives a really good example of how the Bacchus cult, which could kind of seem kind of interesting because of what they did, but the Roman Senate took a very serious interest in it, and it actually shows us how the Roman Empire actually conducted their investigations, because they were sending some of the highest officials in the Roman government to go investigate what Christianity was doing. I think what the Pliny letter actually shows, when he's writing over to him, to Trajan, is that they should be tortured, they should, if they're not going to go ahead and come over, then they should be killed. So if we look at what was the result, what the Roman Empire did is they were crucifying, not only crucifying, but they were torturing the Christians. And and to Pliny's case, he didn't really know what to do when he came upon them, but the order was still to persecute them. But what we don't have from the Roman Empire is any type of tome refuting anything that they said, when they obviously had the historians to do so. I mean, apart from Josephus, who was the Jewish one, they did have Tacitus. They did have they had Tacitus, they had Pliny, they had Livy. They had all these great historians, but not one tome coming out explaining what was happening. Pilate obviously has records, and Tertullian, Eusebius, and Justin said that there were documents that were submitted, that were sent over to the Senate, but what we don't have is any indictment on Christianity, on what is said was false, when they obviously were in a position to falsify Christianity. All they had to do was write a tome explaining what has happened. Here's the guys who wrote it. Here's what they went ahead and said. But we were able to disprove Christianity because of this, this, and this. And we don't have any ancient tome coming out from the Roman Empire, the Jews, or the Sadducees refuting what they said.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
All right. So you said that Christianity can be falsified if we produce the body. How would
That's
we go about
correct.
falsifying it if
Or
Christ never existed?
it's either, because when we talk about the body of evidence, you don't have to actually have a physical body to commit to convict someone of murder. You just have to explain what has happened. They were the last person on scene. It's pretty normal in any court of law where the body of evidence doesn't have to show the body, but they have to be able to explain what had happened.
But
And the purpose of bringing up James Randi is that's what he was able to do in his scientific investigations to disprove the so-called psychics.
My question,
Christianity, I mean, when we think of, Buddha under the bo tree, how do we falsify his inner experience? We can't. Muhammad, we can easily explain what happened with Muhammad after preaching 13 years in Mecca. He gets kicked out. He comes back with an army of 10,000 people. If I came on the show with 10,000 people right now, with swords and knives and everything else, you guys would probably believe I'm a prophet too. So we can explain the existence and how other religions came to power. But when we look at Christianity, it's very easy to falsify Christianity and write off our entire history with just that one event.
But what if, I'm going to repeat my question, rephrase
so
it maybe.
Where's the tome from the ancient world? I mean, Christians, weren't in power. The Constantine settlement did not happen for basically, another 320 something years.
Okay, what if Jesus existed and he was made up wholesale, total myth? No, in other words, what if Paul made a cult out of a fictional character?
You go, Patient.
How would we go about falsifying Christianity if there never was a body to produce?
I can't hear. Is Patient going?
I don't know. I can't hear him either.
Oh.
I know he came in really low. I tried. Patient, are you there?
Yeah. Can you guys hear me?
Now we can.
Oh, my bad. My connection was. I had the stream going and mute. I didn't realize it was killing my connection like that. My question is if Christianity is a myth, and let me rephrase that, if Christ was a myth made up wholesale and he never actually existed, how would we go about falsifying it if there never was a body to produce?
And that's a good question, Patient, because I think in that case, in that situation, that deals with the body. But here's the other problem that comes with that. So if Christ was a myth, there was no resurrection, there was no real person named Christ, and if Dr. Carrier is right that these were just type of hallucinations, you can still falsify it because all you had to do is produce the authors of the books. Because remember,
why would that falsify it?
Because
producing authors of anonymous books.
Well, and so that's the thing is if you, because it goes to, here's what happened. I mean, how else do you explain the development of the church? I mean, who created all these churches? I mean, the churches are real. Congregations.
Paul did when he made up everything after Acts.
Wait,
say that one more time.
Up every day.
How did Paul make up anything in Acts? Acts was written in 90 CE.
I said everything after Acts. Paul made up. Everything after Acts, but not Revelation, was written first. And then you have the Gospels.
He only wrote 7 of those epistles, so he didn't make up everything.
Okay, well, let's just take the 7 he wrote, and let's say that he just made them up completely. And this is why, none of the Roman historians took Christians seriously, because they looked at it from the outside like you look at Islam, like you look at Muhammad. You say, of course, Muhammad's, known fiction. How are we supposed to falsify it if Paul made up, Christ and he never actually existed?
Well, the ancient authorities, so Rome was in a position to falsify it. They're out there obviously torturing Christians. They're investigating. I mean, Paul met with Felix and Festus and the son of Herod. These are high officials in the Roman Empire taking a very keen interest in what is going on in Christianity. So obviously, where are the results from their investigations? And this is what Justin Martyr, Tertullian, Eusebius, that they were very interested in it. Where are Pilate's acts? Where are the acts from Felix and Festus, who actually conducted an investigation into what was happening with Christianity? And, we're talking about...
Well, how do we know? Aren't we just assuming that it's true and working backwards from there? Isn't that the wrong way to go about it?
Well, the question is, if it's all fake, and let's say, for argument's sake, you're right, that the letters, Jesus, all this was fake. Well, you got 27 books of the New Testament that you have to explain. We know who wrote the Aeneid. We know who Virgil was. We have a great deal of information about the time he lived.
So you have a lot of church leaders writing a lot of documents. What about the Apocrypha then? How come that doesn't get to be deemed reliable, but those 27 books are deemed reliable? Why is it up to just the Council of Nicaea to decide what
That's wrong. Council of Nicaea did not decide the biblical canon. Please stop saying that.
I cannot remember where it was decided, but
there was no council that decided biblical canon. It developed over a long period of history. By the time Council of Nicaea even came around, it was almost established in Christian thought anyways.
So how are we supposed to distinguish between that and the Apocrypha?
Okay,
now that didn't get included. What was also written? In other words, there was a lot of other fiction written about Jesus at the time, and there are a lot of religious people who deny that this stuff is. They say that it's just fan fiction of the day. But you have these 27 books, and these are reliable. and they all read more or less the same. How are we supposed to, you know, it seems to me like a lot of people were treating it like it was fiction back in the day. So how are we supposed to distinguish between, you know, those stories that people are saying that are known to have been made up, and the ones that you're saying are not made up, but include fantastic tales of people walking on water, and the, you know, the graves of the ancients resurrecting, and going into the town and talking to the townspeople. Like like these are all fantastic claims, and when we hear these claims, we tend to assume that what we're reading is fiction, and we have a lot of other Jesus-based fiction of the time. So how are we supposed to accept what's in the Bible as true and all these others as just fan fiction?
Okay. Now, first, I want to commend Christopher for correctly identifying that the canon was never decided, especially at Nicaea. They did talk about what books they had, but excellent point, Christopher. Most people get that wrong, and they try to say that at the Council of Nicaea they decided the Bible. And there's actually no council that ever said, you know, until Trent was the first to say this is the canon of the New Testament. And Patient, you bring up an excellent point, and I think this is where a lot of Christians have difficulty explaining this, because you're absolutely right. What Nag Hammadi shows is that there were at least 50 other so-called apostolic writings or claims to Christianity. We obviously have the Gospel of Peter. We have the Gospel of Truth written by the Valentians. So we have 50 other so-called claims against it. Now, so I think you bring up a real good point. Why are we going to accept these when there was hundreds of others, most likely, throughout the first century and the second century? Now, Irenaeus and Tertullian both deal with this problem. They said when we look at all the official churches of Paul, churches that can document a legal chain of custody back to the apostles. So these lists, so when the churches were set up, they were very organized. And we have two ancient documents from Tertullian in North Africa and Irenaeus of Lyons at the opposite side of the Roman Empire, explaining how the churches were set up and organized and how they were able to secure the text of the New Testament. Because, Patience, when you bring up about the Gnostic sects, what do we see between the edition of Marcion, the edition of Valentians? What do we see with Basilides? We see all these different type of texts. There's no agreement of them. There's no agreement. But when we go to the official churches of the apostles, how do you explain that they all come up with the same four texts, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and also they name the same authors for texts that then have their names on them, the 14 letters of Paul, and Revelation was disputed. They did have First Peter, but how do you explain that they came up with the same four Gospels and they came up with the same names, unless it does go back to the authors, as Irenaeus and Tertullian said it did?
Well, first off, they don't match, and second off, Mark was written in 70 CE, Matthew and Luke were written in 80, and John was written after that, and so it's simple plagiarism off of previously existing works, and they don't match, and there's a lot of serious discrepancies in there. And there's also things that we know that are in those texts that are verifiably wrong. We know, for example, that the census in Luke that Luke mentions never actually happened. So, how do we go about reconciling, you know, that if we know that there are things that are verifiably unreliable in the text?
If I can interject really quick?
Yeah, go ahead, Christopher.
Okay, one thing is that patient, you really oversimplified the process of Matthew, Mark, or Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John's creation. Yes, it is true that Matthew and Luke both copy from Mark quite extensively, but they also have evidence that clearly shows they also have some quite original content. While while
That
Matthew,
is correct. I called it plagiarism. I didn't call it blanket copying. It's plagiarism because they borrowed from Mark, they borrowed from other things, but that's why
it's only
they tell a similar story. That was my answer because I was answering his why they tell a similar story question.
it's only
I
plagiarism.
didn't mean to be ambiguous about it.
uh, you're applying a modern sense of plagiarism to an ancient text, which just doesn't apply. Ancient authors throughout all of history are consistently would take and borrow from each other. We know that the Epic of Atrahasis and the Epic of Gilgamesh did this. We have examples where they actually copied from each other verbatim. Uh, this was just this was a somewhat common practice to take works that you agreed with and to copy them, lots of times for sake of speed and ability to write. Uh, but then Matthew and Luke had their own, or Matthew and Luke had their own oral traditions and other traditions like the Q source behind them. And then John is not based on, doesn't actually take from any of them that we can tell. He obviously didn't take the time to like linguistically copy any of them. And then also, Jonathan is completely right that almost every apostolic father that I can think of off the top of my head, all of them considered the four gospels that we have now to be canon. They did debate over some of the Pauline epistles, like First and Second Timothy were heavily debated. The Petrine epistles were debated. Revelation was debated. Jude wasn't even considered canon by any of the apostolic fathers until I think Origen. But for the most part, most of the Pauline epistles were. Now, there are epistles also in there that we don't have now, like Laodiceans and the third epistle of the Corinthians and stuff like that, which are now lost. But and there were other books like First Clement, which was very narrowly was rejected from the canon. There were many sources that liked that as well, but to say that they disagreed on, that they don't line up, they all line up, particularly when it comes to the Pauline epistles, unless you ask the Ebionites, but we don't have any records actually the Ebionites to know for sure what they wanted. But yeah.
Well, you say they all line up, but like there's some serious discrepancies in many of them. Like for example, Matthew 25 mentions the graves of the ancients being, being split open, and the saints going into the town and speaking to the townspeople. And it's only mentioned in Matthew. That's like a significant event. The dead are walking the streets when Jesus died in at the end of Matthew, and they're not doing it in any of the other gospels.
But you're strawmanning what Jonathan was saying. He was saying that the apostolic lineup of the canon was consistent, not what was in the gospels themselves. There's a difference. He was saying that the apostolic fathers' canons were, for the most part, consistent with each other.
Yeah, no, that's correct. The patient. The one thing we got to look at first is, the Gnostics groups, and we know of at least 50 different texts, and it lines up with what Irenaeus was saying in his Against Heresy books about these other documents. We find them at Nag Hammadi. And so when we apply the standard of the apostolic churches, so Paul's churches, the churches in Asia Minor, we look at Rome, Alexandria, all these historical churches throughout the Roman Empire, they all line up with the same four texts that didn't have their name on it, and everyone comes up with the same name, where the Gnostics were all disagreed amongst themselves. So how do you explain that unless it does go back to the apostles? Now, some of the parts that you were talking about, Mark was first. Well, that was only suggested in 1785. no ancient, you have no ancient testimony before 1785. I don't even know how you call that ancient. Uh, there's no independent church, though these churches were fighting over everything. Theologies, when Easter should be observed. They debated Hebrews and Revelation. There was talk of Second Peter, but none of them said Mark was first. The two hypothesis theory didn't gain any real traction or come into existence until 1838. So when we see the rise of the German rationalism coming out of that particular school of thought, that's where you see the development of these theories. And it really comes back, and it goes back into the Christ myth theory as well, because what do we see but these theories emerging right at the same time? Because what happens? David Strauss, who I believe came out of the Tübingen school, within the German school of thought, was the first to propose that Christ and all these theories and all these contradictions were all a myth. So 1800 years after the so-called events is the development of these theories. And it really boils down to the argument that there's no ancient testimony that speaks of this narrative that you're promoting until 1785 with Christopher Staub, that Mark was first. What empirical data did he base that off of? If every independent church, and remember the Aramaic churches swear that their text of Matthew was in Aramaic first. None of the official churches ever said Mark was first. Irenaeus in the 2nd century from Asia Minor and Gaul said Mark was second. And the thing is, it's not about him. It's just everyone else said the same thing. So we have independent witnesses coming to the same testimony. And in any normal court of law, that would be conclusive. And the theories that you're stating don't come up until 1700 years after the events.
So,
Okay.
Jonathan,
So how do we? I'm still trying to figure out how all of that tied back into falsifying. You're talking about the validity of the historical documents here.
Yeah, we're talking about the documents because remember the positive empirical evidence for Christianity is we have these 4 documents.
Okay,
Matthew,
but we can't consider the content of the documents when we're trying to determine their reliability.
Oh no,
Am I correct in that?
No. We can. Obviously, the content is important. I mean, we don't open up War and Peace, find out we're reading, Gone with the Wind. It's obvious. We're talking. So we're talking about the witness testimony, and the basis of the falsification is what we find in all 4 Gospels is the birth, the life, the death, and the resurrection of Christ. So while they may have some differences, which in any court of law, you're talking about 4 individual perspectives on Christianity that's coming up with basic.
We're also talking about two other things as well. We're talking about fantastic claims that we have not been able to verify, like resurrections and people turning water into wine and all that. And the other part of it is, I lost my train of thought.
No, it's okay. Does Red want to say anything? I feel bad that Red hasn't talked. Or Christopher, you had a comment too, right?
Oh,
I'll wait for Red.
I was going to say the other thing is we know there's verifiably false information in there, like the census in Luke that did not actually happen. That's my other point. So, those were what I was bringing up about the content of the Gospels, when we're talking about their historical reliability. That's why I was confused that you guys went down
Yeah.
that other rabbit hole.
Well, yeah, and the thing we're trying to bring is these were published in the ancient world, all over the Roman Empire.
But that doesn't make them not fiction.
Well, the thing is, where is the indictment from the Roman Empire? I mean, this was published under their control, and
okay,
we've
and
heard.
that means that a man actually resurrected. How?
No, it doesn't. The thing is, we have all these independent churches publishing the same testimony throughout the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire got involved and conducted their own independent investigation. So where are the results? I mean, like today, if the government doesn't convict or indict you, you're innocent. And the only other explanation we can have is they couldn't produce the body because it either did resurrect, or they couldn't explain this.
If the government doesn't convict you, you could be not guilty. You could be, you could have committed the crime, but the government doesn't determine innocence or guilt, for one. And two, how does any of this falsify the timeline with the order that the Gospels were written in, and the theory that Matthew and Luke borrowed from Mark and other sources, and then John borrowed from the previous sources that it had to work with?
Well, who said that in the ancient world, though? The thing is, you're propagating a theory that only came to light in 1838. We
don't have any evidence of anything before those times. So when you're talking about give me like the time frame you're trying to discuss here, because if we have documentation coming out in like the 40s and the 50s, we don't have how am I trying to say this? Like, if the documentation's coming out, decades after the event, or maybe the documentation was known fiction. Maybe people were they used the stories for the moral lessons, but they didn't take Jesus seriously as a real person, and that didn't happen till later on. Like, how does how does this demonstrate it seems like we're still dealing with an unfalsifiable claim, because you're saying that we have to be able to produce the body, but you're assuming that a body existed.
Well, no, we don't. All the Roman Empire had to do is, if there was no body and Christ never existed, these documents did, and these churches did as well. All they would have to do was produce a tome explaining what has happened. These 4 guys or 2 guys or whoever it was got together, created this myth. Why is it that we understand, we know who wrote?
They weren't trying to correct it. They were trying to control the masses with it. That's what you do with a cult. That's what you do with a religion. You don't correct the record. You keep control.
Well, they went and investigated the Bacchus cults, who didn't pose even half the danger.
Okay, Jonathan, I want to note that, though. I mean, you noted Livy as your example of that, but Livy died 20 years before Christ died, and he also he died 40 years before, close to that, before we have Paul writing around. So it's not, and then there's also the problem of that Christianity developed and was until after after Paul was not even really prevalent anywhere except for mostly in Judea, and that's where most of the persecution and investigation took place. And I also looked up your references to those Roman officials that investigated. The one in the book of Acts in particular investigates Paul, Seneca's brother.
Uh-huh.
He actually doesn't really investigate. What ends up happening is that the Jews end up persecuting Paul and bringing him before the governor, and the governor is basically like, I can't find anything wrong. Go on. There's nothing particularly scrupulous about his care or detailed analysis of Christianity. And every source that we have from ancient Rome really is that they didn't care that much. Now, I do want to note with patient is that the mythical Christ thing is nonsense. If we could all just stop with the Christ mythicism, that would be wonderful.
Well, you guys did invite a mythicist onto the show, just so
I-
you know. That is the boat I row in.
No, it's fair. I just think the mythers have even more problems to explain because of the fact that who created all these churches, who wrote these 27 books. Paul wrote all 27 books?
No, but Paul got the ball rolling. The earliest works are attributed to Paul.
Okay, but I mean, who wrote Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Revelation?
That's a really good question, and that's another problem is that we don't know. Probably the same people who wrote Second Timothy and Lucius and Clementine and the others.
Well, but the apostolic churches did know, and they all come up with the same testimony. So we're talking about independent churches in Greek, Coptic, Latin, and Aramaic coming up with the same testimony. And you already said, Patience, that there was 50 or 100 other apocryphal texts out there claiming the same. So there was obviously no central authority.
So how do you know which one's true? How do you know any of them are true?
Well, where independent witnesses agree, that would be conclusive. The Gnostics were all different. And
what independent witnesses actually agree with what you're saying?
So you have the churches of Asia Minor coming up with the same 4 books, naming the same author. You have the Greek churches coming up with the same 4 books, naming the same author. We have the Aramaic churches; they have the same 4 books.
And what's the timeline on that?
Well,
if you have one source and you translate it and you go in different directions, you can do these things. It's not that difficult.
Well, if you have Uthman, now the Muslims, when they standardized their text, they had the 3rd Caliph. So they had Uthman there to not only burn all their variants, but they were able to centralize a text and send it out to the 7 provinces for their groups. But where do you see that in Christianity? Where's the historical event of that occurring in Christianity? I mean, because Irenaeus is 175, Tertullian is 190. And what they're saying is that the empirical observation, when you go and examine all these churches, they have the same testimony. And they appeal to them as independent witnesses throughout, because the Gnostic texts were all different. How do you explain?
I guess when you said witnesses, I was getting a little more specific, but like I said, you just mentioned that the Muslims did it. So
okay,
anybody with a little bit of means can do this. It's not that difficult.
But Uthman was the 3rd Caliph. He was the equivalent of God in their area. He was the mechanism to do that. But you don't have any mechanism in the 1st or 2nd or 3rd century to do that. In Christianity, there's no central authority. So how else do you explain that all these independent witnesses come up with the same text, unless it does go back and this is, are you saying that the Roman Empire could not determine? They were torturing the Christians, and Christopher brought this up with Pliny the Younger. They were persecuting them. If we read about Cyprian and the Lapse, it talks about all these Christians being persecuted under the Roman Empire. But you're saying they could not determine who the author of these books were?
If the authors of the book are anonymous, then you could torture somebody for information they don't have all you want.
But who said they were anonymous in the ancient world?
Where is authorship attributed to them anywhere?
Irenaeus and Against Heresies, Book 3. Tertullian against Marcion, and the case against Marcion is even more specific because Marcion came up with his own version of Paul and 10 letters of Paul that he said were the official writings of the apostle. So you have independent attestation in different languages, in geographic areas, coming up with the same book, naming the same authors. So Paul that he said were the official writings of the apostle. So you have independent.
Okay.
Hello, what happened?
I think we were hearing an echo of somebody playing the video.
We have two modern days in the chat.
Yeah.
I'm going to say we have a spiritual one and we have a physical one. I want to see what Red has to say because Red has been really silent.
I know. I feel bad, Red.
Yeah. Well,
I'll let you go back to it.
Yeah. Well, the only thing I would bring up, like, I'm not going to argue against the historicity of Jesus or anything like that, of the person existing. It still doesn't, what these church fathers and stuff believe about Jesus' divinity, you know, even if it goes back there, doesn't make these things true, right?
Correct.
You know, that Christianity is true and all this other stuff. So I find it hard, you know, looking at your original video, like one of the things I'd, you know, take a little more modern example for is to look at like Scientology. I mean, it's small and it's getting smaller because the access to the internet and all this other stuff, we can more quickly and easily expose how bad of a cult that is. But that's something right there that's made up whole cloth. And it's followed and it has spread. It doesn't lend any truth to whether or not this stuff is true, right? And I would think going back into the ancient world, especially with an empire as large as Rome was, they would have been in contact with several different faiths and beliefs that were different from what they had. So somebody coming up and preaching these, you know, that a man rose from the dead or this and that stuff wouldn't necessarily be something that would be uncommon for him to hear about. You know what I mean? Some magical event. You know, so I think there's a lot of assumption with, well, they didn't rebuke it, they didn't refute it, so everything that happened is true. It's bad reasoning.
Well, like for instance, so we have an ancient document from Eusebius, who in his histories writes, who speaks of Pilate actually having transmitted to Tiberius an account of the circumstances concerning the resurrection of Christ, and that during the reign of Maximus, a false axe of Pilate was forged specifically for the purpose of discrediting the older acts. And anyone who wants to look it up, Christopher, you can, in his Ecclesiastical History, Book 2, Chapter 2, you can see that. And he actually speaks.
I know what you're talking about. I actually have my copy of Eusebius open next to me. So.
Oh, okay. And where he talks about the forge is in Chapter 9, but we have Justin Martyr, who writes about it too. Not necessarily the forge, but they talk about, hey, Pilate was there. Where are his official acts? I mean, this is not something that's uncommon to the ancient world. They had official records. So all Pilate had to do was to produce his official acts, and that would discredit Christianity if what they were saying was all false.
But I'm not suggesting that if Jesus existed and Pilate executed him, I mean, that would have been in his things. I can't imagine, that would prove anything, that Christianity is true, that all this other stuff happened. And I imagine part of the issue with records and stuff from that time, does come about because of the war, right? A lot of stuff will get lost in wars and stuff like that. Christopher can, correct me if I'm wrong on any of that, but
You are completely right in that regard. Like, if the biggest, one of the largest issues that we have for the ancient world is the amount of conflict that was taking place. Like, if you look at Ugarit, we've lost endless numbers of papyri. That was probably the common method of writing there. Actually, not the cuneiform tablets that we have there. And that's just and those are severely damaged from the battle, from the sea peoples that came there. We had the same problems with Egyptian records being burned and destroyed. The burning of the Library of Alexandria destroyed so many records. It's unbelievable how much we lost there. There's the war with the Romans in Judea. The Romans sacked Jerusalem. Who knows how many records were lost when they sacked Jerusalem?
Especially the Jerusalem church, yeah.
Yeah. Who knows? Well, and the destroying of the Second Temple, and an example I'm going to give, because I'm a nutter about the Book of Job, is that we have completely lost the writings, or the midrash for the Book of Job. That's completely gone. This is one of the problems of history, is that we cannot guarantee the maintaining of all these sources. We don't have any extant sources for Justin the Martyr, only the quotations within other church fathers. And we don't have the writings of Marcion, only quotations from Tertullian and other church fathers. That's just the curse, unfortunately.
Yeah. And we don't have stuff from some of the other sects of early Christianity, like the Ebionites or whatever. We have nothing.
Correct.
No, but and that is fair to say. The one thing we do know from Irenaeus's writings is what he said about these Gnostic sects and their beliefs. We can verify a good deal of this information from what we found at Nag Hammadi, because we do have 50 texts, and it does go into these other particular groups, which shows us how expansive these other groups were. That's why we look at the independent apostolic churches coming up with these same 4 books, naming the same authors. It becomes overwhelming, because when you apply that to the Gnostic standard, where everything was mixed up, you see a united testimony when there's no central authority. But given that, yes, we have lost some documentation, there's nothing given, we still have the ability. I mean, we have all these great historians with all these works that came down, and yet Christianity, even in the face of years afterwards, we had Celsius, and yes, we do only have what we have from Celsius from Origen. So we have, a philosopher in the ancient world trying to rule out Christianity. We have Profer of Tyre, one of the greatest anti-Christian philosophers of his time, trying to rule out. But what we don't have is any refutation, and we have a gradual development of Christianity not only becoming a dominant religion, but converting the intellectual class going into the 4th century. But not one record or tome refuting what Christianity has said up to that point.
Right. I get what you're saying with that. The problem that I see with trying to go with that line of arguing is that we're also dealing with in my opinion, with a culture that other than, I'd say of all the people of Roman history that we have that were seriously concerned, at least for the first 3 centuries, was Tacitus. and he barely cares about them enough to even warrant them as more than just a little footnote in the annals. Suetonius doesn't even get his information correct. He thinks that Jesus was some rebellion leader in Rome. So he didn't care enough about the Christians really to say much about them that was accurate. You have we do have Tacitus, whose information is for the most part correct, but he doesn't care to even bring up their beliefs. So he's not even interested in refuting them, because he's not even interested in reporting what they believe. He's just interested in reporting the historical data. And with that, it's interesting that he doesn't know an empty tomb. He doesn't know a burial at all. Doesn't know any of that. Then we have Josephus. Josephus again is not other than what could be in the Testimonium, and I personally favor the Arabic line of transmission as making it legitimate. He's only reporting marginally what they believe, but doesn't, but only in a very cursory view, and he's not doing it as any attempt at a polemic. So he's not going after with a goal of refuting to begin with. So we can't expect him to be wanting to do that. And then the other mention in book 20 is just cursory glance with the James brother, the Jesus brother James reference. And then we have Pliny, who is interesting and actually helps with the historicist argument. But a side note, he basically all he knows is that they worship Jesus as a god, and that was it. They're just not interested in refuting Christianity because they don't really see it that interesting. The only reason that it's even illegal is because it's just a cult that's causing some trouble in Judea, and they don't like that it's causing a ruckus over there.
Yeah, but they did murder and torture the Christians, and
they murdered and tortured people of numerous religions. They murdered and tortured Zoroastrians and Phoenicians and other cult beliefs. It wasn't unusual.
No, but they did send their highest officials to go investigate Christianity. So, I mean,
well, no, they didn't send them to. Usually, what happened was that Jews got upset and then brought Christians before the officials. The officials didn't go investigating. Not that I remember in any of their sources.
Yeah.
I don't remember any Romans officially going out and investigate this. In fact, that's quite the opposite of what the emperor tells Pliny. He tells Pliny, don't go searching them out. If they come up in the law, then persecute them. But if not, I don't care. So yes, they did persecute them, but they weren't actively seeking them out, at least not in early Christianity. And that's also what we get in the records in the New Testament, is that if you actually look at it, the Romans are the first people who basically come to the aid of Paul and the Christians, because it's usually just Jews getting really mad and killing them. Or persecuting him or something, and then the Romans were like, "No, just back off. They haven't done anything illegal. We don't care beyond that."
Oh, did you want to say something, Red? I didn't want to jump in.
Oh, no, I'm along the same lines as Christopher on this. It's not anything out of the ordinary that would require them to give any kind of huge refutation. It's so
just dealing with another run-of-the-mill cult that's causing trouble. Like, I mean, if dying for your belief was, like made it more true, I mean, Islam would be winning today.
No, yes, but with Islam, we can explain what happened with Islam in its rise to power. Obviously, Muhammad raising up an army and going back to the city that kicked him out explains why they understood him as a prophet. And his experience in the cave is not a falsifiable event, because how do you read their minds? It's the same thing with Buddha under the Bo tree. What
Jesus
experience?
isn't a falsifiable event either.
Which one?
Jesus isn't a falsifiable event either. What he did isn't falsifiable either. So,
Well,
Of course.
some
Well,
quite a bit of what he did would, well, some of what he did would be. I mean, if we go with the Jesus seminar, at the minimum, 12% of everything in the Gospels and the Gospel of Thomas can be traced back to him. I don't agree with the Jesus seminar's methodology, but I do agree with I do at least agree with the 12% percentile there. But so yeah, there is stuff that can be falsified about Jesus. And if we want to go from a scientific analysis purely, I think that even from a scientific analysis of things, Jonathan and I could agree that from a naturalist point of view, a scientific empiricist point of view, there is no way that we could scientifically say that some of that stuff happened. That stuff is beyond what science is capable of doing. From that point of view, is that the falsification from a scientific point of view is that we can't even deal with it. So, but that it gets iffy because it is also a realm that is more in regards to metaphysics of philosophy.
yeah, I would. I mean, and Christopher's right on that.
well, you can't philosophize God into existence.
No. And this is not a philosophical argument. If the Jews, if the Pharisees, the Sadducees, or the Roman government, three independent powers that had the historians, had the investigators to do so, any one of their tombs explaining what had happened would falsify Christianity. And regardless of what happened afterwards, if we had that testimony, that would falsify Christianity from the face of the earth, and it would become just like any number one of these religions.
How would we falsify the resurrection other than to say that we can't demonstrate that it's even possible today?
Well, you know, the thing I liked about James Randi, because I thought it was hilarious, and I actually watched some old clips of him setting up these conditional experiments where he would have, it was like the $1 Million Challenge, which is great. And obviously, I can't afford to do a $1 Million cartoon video for anyone to come out and falsify Christianity. But and thing about James was he knew scientifically he can recreate their experiments and falsify what they were doing. And so even in modern times, if you think about it, how would we go about falsifying Christianity in a controlled event or setting? Because you got to think about what the Gospels say. Let's put aside the miraculous events that obviously we're not going to agree on.
But those are the most damning.
No. The biggest thing is we have a guy named Joseph of Arimathea claiming the body in a known city that he's burying him. So you have a name of someone who took control of the body, buried him. I mean, a well-known person in a city that is not Harry Potter. I mean, it's a real city that we can visit today. And 50 days later, after the resurrection, Peter is out there giving sermons that draws this big crowd. So in the same city, and think about that for a second, because I'm from Brooklyn, New York, where I grew up. So that's like the equivalent of saying someone got shot and killed in Times Square, and then a few days later, the guy rose up again from the grave, and someone got out there. So journalists would be all over that place investigating to find out what happened. And
okay, do you have any references to Joseph of Arimathea outside of the Gospels?
no, but the Gospels, if you think about it, those were published in the ancient world. So why would
They were, and they made fantastic claims that are generally considered to be fiction. So if they mention a person in them, that person is also not reliably shown to have exist because
Okay, patient. I'm gonna note that that isn't just a completely incredulous methodology to put on the Gospels, though, because if I applied that same methodology to Plutarch, do you know how problematic that would become? Because Plutarch
well,
makes claims just as wild, just as spectacular, sometimes more so than the Gospels ever do. And so does
okay,
every other ancient historian. That's not a criteria you can judge the Gospels by. Sure, we can wade through the what we deem to be the myth and the mystical elements, but I mean the reality is that there's nothing super mystical associated with Joseph of Arimathea. I personally don't think that Joseph was or that Jesus was buried in a tomb or anything like that. He was historical and everything, but there is nothing particularly crazy about a Joseph of Arimathea, especially because he is attested in 4 different lines of transmission for those 4 gospels.
Yeah, and the point of this is these are items that can be investigated. We're not talking about supernatural hallucinations or stuff that we cannot test. But if I give you a name and a city, someone can check that out. And that's what we're saying in reference to the Gospels. They're making claims to governors in the Roman Empire on which this was done at. So that information can be checked out. Apart from all the miracles, if someone claimed his body, buried it in this city, I mean, these aren't the Church of Latter-day Saints where we're trying to identify cities that never existed. Jerusalem is well known in the ancient world. We're given names and dates and periods of time where all this can be investigated and checked out, and which sets up. So if someone today wanted to create a control environment, all they would have to do is set up a very similar situation to falsify what the Gospels did. I mean, where else in history do we see that same event? I mean, now Plutarch is a good example. And I'm glad you brought that up, Christopher, because he does speak about an event where Romulus is declared to have been risen from the dead. Now, obviously, the Senate cannot be challenged. And it's no surprise why the Senate said that he rose from the dead. You got something, James?
We are going to have to move to Q&A. I hate to cut you off, Jonathan. Forgive me for that. Definitely am enjoying it. It's been a really good discussion. It's been a wild tussle in the Lion's Den. I don't know if I sent a few messages to the group, and I only heard one back from one of you. We're going to move into the Q&A. And so it is everybody okay with that?
Yeah, that's fine with me.
I'm good. Yeah.
Okay. So very exciting, and again, I am excited for both what's happened and what is to come with our questions. We have a good amount here, so I'm going to read these off. And so some of these are for Jonathan, and then some of these are for our 3 lions. So both Daniel and the lions. And first is from Pine Creek. So the first is for Jonathan, and Pine Creek asked Jonathan, does Sheffield need, quote unquote, proof that Christianity is false? Or is it, quote unquote, okay to doubt the core claims to disbelieve?
No, I think it's important that we actually test Christianity against a scientific objective, So I think, from my standpoint, all they would have to do is, provide ancient tomes that explained what happened from the ancient world, and that would discredit Christianity for me, and I'd move on and make cartoons on a different subject matter.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Let me find I've got the rest of the questions compiled here, and as I pull up the next one, I want to say thank you for the audience for your questions. They are honestly very interesting. As I've gotten to read through these, I'm like, I like what I'm seeing here. And also, if you're new here, feel free to hit that subscribe button as we have future debates coming up, and including Lions Den matches. And who knows, we might have one of our lions jump into the den and switch places. That's going to be an exciting deal too. So like my hope is, if you do come back, we'll get to have these debaters on, as I appreciate our debaters all putting in their time. So next question is, the Broken God asks, is it justified, and I think this is meant to be for Sheffield. My assumption is it's usually for the Lions. So is it justified to accept something as true just because it hasn't been disproven? So I'm not sure with regard to what the Broken God was referring to there. Does anybody know what in particular? Was there like maybe an argument from silence they might be referring to?
It kind of sounds almost like just an argument from, I guess, ignorance. Basically, kind of the idea that, are we justified in believing in fairies if we can't disprove them?
It is the argument from ignorance. It is I believe in X because X has not been proven false, or I believe it false because it has not been proven true. The argument from ignorance goes both ways, but yeah.
I think it's a question more around the argument that Jonathan's been putting forward all night. Is more what the question is that these ancient sources attest to these certain things. We don't have anybody that says otherwise, so I'm going to accept it to be true. I think that's where the question's coming from.
Yeah, and I would just say it's twofold. So, I mean, obviously I'm pushing a strong argument from silence on the side of a group that obviously had the opportunity and they had the scholarship and the historians to do so. And then from the positive empirical side of the evidence, we have all these gospels that were published throughout the ancient world that made these claims, and they all came up with basically the same testimony about what happened. And I kind of look at it as we have these witnesses, at least from my standpoint, that saw the murder happen. And from the outside world, we're saying, well, we're not going to trust those witnesses because they're biased because they saw the guy do it and killed him. So we're not going to let them speak because they're already prejudiced against my client because they saw him do it. That kind of explains a little bit more about my rationale.
Gotcha. I appreciate that. We have another question. This is Pine Creek is a master of good questions. So Pine Creek is coming at you again, Jonathan. So ready for this one. Basically, Pine Creek asks, if a historian in the early 20th century, and remember for viewers or just as a reminder, some of you, if you remember the 20th century, it's like you jump back. So like early 1900s. If a historian in the early 20th century reports on the golden plates in Mormonism, is that evidence that the golden plates actually existed and were the words of God to the Americas?
Well, here's the thing about the golden plates. They're almost like the Gospel of Q theory. We don't have them. We don't have, the thing with the New Testament is we actually have biblical artifacts, which are the texts of the New Testament. The golden plates that were given over to Joseph Smith, presented to him by Moroni. Once again, it's a non-falsifiable event because that was an inner experience that he had that we cannot falsify. And we don't have any copies of. If they showed me the golden plates, I'm ready to believe. But and that's why I tell Mormons when they come to my house all the time, show me the golden plates and I'll believe. So the thing about the golden plates is, first, it's an inner experience between Joseph Smith and his angels. So how do we even falsify that event? And then we have no golden plates, but we have texts of the New Testament: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, in Greek, Latin, Aramaic, Vedic Latin, Gothic, Ethiopian. We have it in all these languages throughout the ancient world, which make claims that can be falsifiable.
Gotcha. Thank you very much, Jonathan. And next, we have a question for our lions. So I appreciate our lions. You know, it just struck me, Christopher, with your hair the way it is, it almost looks like a mane. This is very appropriate. So excellent. One thing we considered, by the way, is lions. I don't know what your thoughts would be about this. We're working on a border, like a nice, like kind of professional looking layout. We were considering like having the boxes for the lions where you would show your faces, and on the outside it would have like a cartoon mane from like a lion surrounding your picture. Okay, I know it's stupid. So let's go to the next question.
Only if I can wear a hat.
Nobody looks impressed. It's okay. So, so anyway, the question is from Jesus is Lord, and it's they said, as a practicing atheist, how do you explain away the empty tomb? So if you guys, I guess if we could let each of the questioners or lions respond to that. I got to just quick check on something. Sound good?
Okay.
So if you want to explain the empty tomb, and I'll be right back. Just 1 second.
All right. Well, I've probably got the shortest answer. Being the mythicist, I still, am in the camp that Jesus never existed, and Paul made Jesus up, and so that's how there's an empty tomb, because it was never filled to begin with. So, next, whoever wants to take it over next.
Okay. My position, I'm a historicist, and anyone who knows me from Twitter knows that I adamantly fight everything to do with mythicism with a passion. But I don't think that he was buried in a tomb. I think that the evidence for Romans allowing burial of crucified victims is scanty at best. Josephus only records it happening in exceedingly rare occasions, and a few other scant occasions that it's mentioned in other ancient sources is not exactly reliable. Generally, they mostly just give the impression that they were just left up to rot. And the thing is that with our earliest source, with Paul, he never actually mentions being buried in a tomb. When he quotes the creedal tradition just says that he was buried and then rose. That is highly ambiguous. Doesn't even mention Joseph of Arimathea or Pontius Pilate either. So, in my personal opinion, and in the opinion of several other scholars, it's in my opinion, it's likely that he was probably thrown in a common grave.
Yeah, I'm not all that different from Chris's position on it. So, he's wasn't buried in the tomb, and so even if he was and it was empty, there's still plenty of different things between when the Gospels and stuff are written and how the actual events about an empty tomb, that it's a lot of hearsay. For something like that it's just going to be hard to find.
There's also a big issue with trying to use the empty tomb example as well, and the issue is that just because even if he was buried in a tomb, the fact that it's empty is not actually really indicative of resurrection. As we know, if anyone knows their Egyptian history, they know that tomb raiding and even stealing of bodies was not uncommon. Yeah. And there is also the problem that if Jesus was buried in the tomb of Arimathea, it was just because it was before Passover, and so it was just to get him buried. The reality, though, is that there's a good chance, if he was buried in there, that after Passover, they would have just moved him to Nazareth, which was his home, to be buried there. In which case, apostles show up, no body there because he's been moved to Nazareth. This is one that Bart Ehrman came up with in his debate with William Lane Craig, if anyone's familiar with that. But there are numerous hypotheses to explain this.
Mm-hmm.
There's also the adamant nut job one from John Dominic Crossan that he was eaten by dogs.
I don't know how you'd ever go about, something like that as a hypothesis to prove.
Crossan is known for his rather wild speculations.
Yeah, that's a really interesting one. And so I won't. Did everybody? Sorry, I had to quick manage something really quick. But did everybody get to respond?
Yep.
Okay, cool. So basically, we don't worry, we've got more. So Pine Creek asks if there was a tome that disproved Christianity. So in other words, like a monstrous book that disproved Christianity, would Sheffield accept it at face value? If not, why does he accept the Gospels at face value?
Yeah, so, I mean, obviously, if there was a credible tome explaining what had happened, that accounts for the empty tomb, these appearances of Jesus after the fact to all these witnesses, it wouldn't take a whole lot, if there was a credible tome explaining what had happened, I'm all about Occam's razor. The simplest explanation is normally it. So, obviously, if there was credible tome that explained what happened, of course, if they came up with account that accounted for the empty tomb and the appearances, of course, and that's where we have to be objective. When we look at the statements that are being made in the gospel accounts.
Unless, of course, they include miracles.
Well, but I mean, if you look at the resurrection, that's a pretty big miracle right there. So, how do we account for it? If I mean, you talk about that. That is the one miracle right there that explains all others. If he did really rise from the dead, then that accounts while all these miracles happen. I mean, if you look in the ancient Jewish Talmudic traditions, they kind of understand Jesus not as a myth, but as a sorcerer, which speaks to the so-called miraculous things that he was doing.
Yeah, but correct me if I'm wrong. Most of the Talmud comes from the 3rd or 4th century, doesn't it? So it's well after. Or is it?
The Talmud actually has a really complicated history because it's a compilation of oral traditions and about the Torah and events that were going on that was compiled actually, and it basically is a compilation of oral traditions anywhere from 400 BC all the way to the end of the Second Temple period, and then it was compiled and written down sometime around circa a year, what was it, 800 or so, but I can't remember what his name was, but it was a prince that eventually ended up standardizing it and went through with the most major redactions of it and everything.
All right.
Sorry, Red. Go ahead.
Oh no, I was just gonna say I was going off memory. I like I said, I gotta swear that a lot of the anti-Jesus stuff in the Talmud was older or
Newer.
newer. Yeah.
Yeah. The thing is that even if it's newer, though, it is also consistent with a lot of what Celsus had to say that as reported in Against Origin. For example, both the Talmud and Celsus like to say that Jesus was for lack of a better term, a bastard, born of the Roman guard Pantera and Mary. That was a fun one. Both of them say that he was a sorcerer, or as Celsus put it in Book 255, a master of juggling tricks, and compares him to Ramphicenides and Zalmoxis and Pythagoras and a few others.
Yeah.
We'll next jump to the next question if everybody's ready. So we do have another one. This is Pine Creek asks, how would you falsify the body of Jesus if he was eaten by dogs and birds in a common grave?
Well, you would have is that for me or for others?
We could actually have everybody take a shot at it, or at least whoever wants to.
Well, Chris, do you want to start it off?
Well, sure. I'll just say that the eaten by dog one, we can't falsify. There's no way to tell if that happened for sure. And really, in the end, when it comes to the body, when someone says produce the body, the big problem with that is the vast majority, especially of ancient Galilean preacher peasants, didn't have very well preserved bodies.
Yeah.
I mean, in grand total, when we know that thousands of people were crucified in the ancient world. Guess how many we have the bodies of? One. We only have one. I mean, that is how scant that it is. I mean, we might possibly have the body of Caiaphas. We don't know. We're still working on actually doing that because we don't know for sure. The writing is a little bit faded away and ambiguous. Is the same problem with the Joseph ossuary as well. We're still trying to figure that out. But the fact of the matter is that if it's Caiaphas, I mean, he was high priest, and he would be the first high priest of Jerusalem during that period that we have any body of. I mean, that's telling you how scant it is that we don't even have the officials' bodies. So honestly, in my opinion, when someone says produce the body, I do actually find that to be unfalsifiable in the end.
Well, yeah, and even in the ancient world, I mean, I can't imagine that they'd have a very good way of identifying the body afterward. You know what I mean? If the Romans pulled him out of, say, oh, here's Jesus' body, they don't have the tools necessary to connect them to that person.
DNA.
Yeah, they don't have.
We don't have DNA.
Yeah.
So it could be anybody.
Yeah, exactly. Especially if thrown in a common grave. Now, if thrown into an actual tomb, and I'm pretty sure that Jonathan would bring this up, if he was actually buried in an actual tomb, common Jewish custom was to put the bones into an ossuary and then inscribe the name on the ossuary. Usually there would be a lot of times it'd also be a family ossuary or family tomb and stuff like that. So there would be names, records in there, but it didn't happen that often for peasant Galilean preachers, especially not Galilean preachers from Nazareth.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, obviously, if you had records testifying that dogs ate them, and that was cool, and if it was corroborated, well, then that would be a tomb. that would provide some sort of narrative from the ancient world. But you don't have to produce the body of Christ to falsify Christianity. I mean, and just like in any normal court of law, you don't need to have the body to have the circumstantial evidence to prove that somebody did it. The last person that was there that seen him after that, we never see him again. So the same thing applies with Christianity. Where is the explanation explaining what happened? So, the dog's eating them. If there was witnesses and the Roman said, some Jews in the late dark at night stole the body or never buried him, and they put it out to a dish, and someone noticed that dogs were eating them, you would just have the letter of confirmation explaining what happened. Not that I would buy the dog story. That's like the Homework story.
In your court analogy, it only goes so far because when you're talking about a murder, that's within the realm of physical possibility. Where you're trying to apply this court analogy to events that are known to be physically impossible.
Well, I mean, yes, but we have to explain it, and what we do know, and while it's a strong argument from silence, is that
well, statistically, a miracle is the least probable possibility. That's why it's called a miracle. It's the least probable possible event to explain an action. If we're going to look at probabilities and we're looking for a missing body, the probability that dogs came and drug him off is way higher than he resurrected after being dead for 3 days and stabbed in the side. He just got up and walked away.
Yeah, I do want to note on probability. I don't like. I had this discussion a little bit ago with another guy. I dislike when people assigning probability to history, because how probable is it that an Austrian corporal would end up controlling Germany and killing 80 million people worldwide? Probably the probability of that happening is very low, but it did happen.
Well, yes, but when we talk about historical probabilities, we're talking about we're taking these probabilities and we're basing them on the claims that are being made. Okay,
but the probability is
what
based.
you just mentioned isn't anything outside of the realm of possibility, though. Somebody resurrecting after 3 days is. So
yeah, but
it's.
Well, it depends on your scope of possibilities. Is the problem? Like if you believe in a god, of course that is within your scope of possibility. So as Bayesian would say, it depends on your priors.
Yeah,
that's still the least probable explanation.
I would agree with that. Yes.
Yeah, unfortunately, applying statistics. In my day job, I do statistics and programming. Even Bayes, observed objective behavior. So applying it to history, if you're going to talk about probability theory, then it's all based on your sample. And if you have no sample, then you can't derive your probabilities without it. So,
we're talking. Our sample is the claims that are being made in the Gospels.
No, it's not. That can't be. That can't be your sample. A sample has to have at least more than one in order for you to even have a sample size. And there's, unfortunately, unless we're going to consider every resurrection of every single myth ever concocted as valid, when the vast majority of them are mutually exclusive, you can't build that sample size.
Well, no, I'm just talking about I'm going much more basic. I'm talking about taking the claims and just examining whether or not they're in the realm of possibility, and then we can say, in these four Gospels they make these sets of fantastic claims that are generally considered impossible, so we can disregard certain events that are mentioned in here as being as being impossible and
I don't think we can
unreliable.
I don't. What we'd have to say is that they are not able to be historically verified. I think that Jonathan and I could agree with that. We can't from a historian's perspective, from an objective historian's perspective, verify those because those are not within the historian's tools to verify.
I can agree with that.
we cannot then go to the conclusion that it is impossible, because then we have to start dealing with the whole metaphysical realm of possibility and dealing with a whole area of philosophy that is outside the scope of this discussion right now.
Yes.
And that's why you usually call it an improbability, because you're keeping it in the realm of real, here.
Right. Maybe we should go to the next question before this continues on forever.
We
These
can go
are
to
fun
the
little tangents, I will admit.
It's all right. It's been interesting. And we have another question. So this is definitely, we're kind of trying to fish one out. My laptop had another one. This basically, the Wi-Fi made it difficult, and the laptop is now dead in terms of battery. So long story short, we do have another one though, for sure. And hopefully we'll be able to dig that other one up. So Pine Creek asks, does Sheffield disagree with the Oxford Annotated Bible page 1744 or 1744 that the Gospels are anonymous, written 40 to 60 years after the death of Jesus?
Well, I think what we have to look at is the empirical data. And, if I'm going to follow the evidence or the weighting of the evidence, what am I going to look to? So, am I going to look to independent attestation from Irenaeus, Tertullian, and given, they're second century, but they're coming up with the same testimony everyone else is coming up to, where they name the same they come up with the same 4 books, and they name the same 4 authors, and the Gnostics, who are all different. I mean, do liars agree where no collusion has been shown to have occurred? And the biggest part of Irenaeus and Tertullian's argument is go to the churches to see for yourself. Examine their independent testimony, because this is what you'll see. And when we do examine that, I don't have to trust Irenaeus or Tertullian. We can go to the physical churches themselves and see their versions, whether it's the Aramaic Peshitta or Jerome's Vulgate or the text of the Greek Orthodox churches. They all come up with these same 4 Gospels, So those are independent witnesses in different languages who have shown no evidence of collusion on this matter.
How did you verify that?
How do you verify? The churches are real,
How do you verify there was no evidence of collusion?
Well, the thing about collusion is you have a historical.
Everybody's stories match.
Well, no, it's not every. The thing is, how do you get them to match? You got to have an event, so you got to have a historical case. I bring up Uthman,
or you've got to be working off a single document.
Okay, but we're talking about the ancient world, where you don't have email or you don't have SQL databases that you can update where they can download the text. We're talking about areas throughout the Roman Empire, and what we can establish in the 1st century, even if you just accept Paul's 7 letters, is that there was a communication system between the churches that was consistent with the communication in that time. I mean, we have the letters to Atticus, so the Roman Empire operated in the same way. I mean, Pliny's
so aren't
letters.
You just answering the question? If the church has this sophisticated, letter writing, communication system, then wouldn't it be pretty easy to send the message to all these different places?
Yeah. Well, where's the letter for that? So where's the letter? And it goes back to Chris's point. Where's the synod that said, "Hey guys, here's what the canon of the New Testament"? But the problem with that statement is
that was like Peter and all of the stuff that Paul wrote to the
no,
churches, wasn't it?
Where does he say in any of his letters that, hey, you need to accept Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? And what we know from the documents is they didn't have their names on them. So how do you explain they all came up with the same 4 names if it doesn't go back to the original authors?
He just
I mean,
sent them a copy of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
but their names weren't on it. How did they all come up with the same testimony?
Well, and Paul wouldn't
well,
have been able to anyways. The Gospels were written after Paul.
Right,
Very true.
but his question
Quite a bit.
is still valid. How did they?
Yeah.
How did they come to the names when the documents themselves are anonymous?
Well, yeah, that goes back to, I mean, they all came up with Matthew, and this is where Tertullian, Eusebius, and Irenaeus talk about the church polity, how the churches were set up and organized. They kept official records for all these events. I mean, the churches themselves did not know the documents, who they were receiving them from, because they actually speak differently. They say that the churches were set up, these apostolic churches, you had to be descended from an apostle or his scribe. And it was these apostles who set up bishops as oversight to oversee the church. So in essence, what you have is
how did they verify these people's lineage?
How did they verify well, if you're receiving them from Paul or Matthew, or in the case of
so we're just taking Paul's word for it, right?
Well, no.
I mean, there's also the fact. I mean, I'm surprised that Jonathan hasn't brought up Papias yet.
Here's the thing:
be our earliest source for the naming of these documents.
Yeah,
and roughly either late 1st century or early 2nd century before Irenaeus or the others. And the interesting thing about Irenaeus is that he actually attests to being informed by people like John the Evangelist and other figures like that. So actual apostles.
Yeah, so he's from a historical church in Asia Minor where he grew up under Polycarp, who Tertullian and Irenaeus says was placed in there by apostles. So they can secure the chain of custody for these texts.
I've got to forgive me. I've got to try to move to the next question just because we've got to.
I did kind of derail it. Go ahead.
That's okay. I just want to respect your guys' time because I know you debaters have got busy lives as well, and I appreciate you doing everything you have. I've got one last one, and that's Pine Creek asked, is there any historical claim in the New Testament that Jonathan thinks probably didn't happen in history?
Is that for me or?
Yep. So you in
Hello?
You in particular, Jonathan, he had asked, is there any historical claim in the New Testament that John or Jonathan thinks probably didn't happen in history?
Any particular?
The census comes to mind.
and I know we can go on probably about 3 hours on that question alone. But I think what we see in the Gospels, is that we have all these different vantage points that are coming from who I recognize as Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, where some of the testimony doesn't seem to totally match up, which when we look at witnesses in any normal court of law, their testimony is not going to be exactly perfect, because if it was, that would then suggest collusion. And so as far as the historicity of what they said, where do they all agree on? They all agree on the birth, life, the death, and the resurrection of Christ.
Not the birth. Mark and John have nothing to particularly say about it. So
correct. Well, the life and the resurrection, for sure.
Well, the resurrection differs on how many people were at the tomb, who was at the tomb, who found the empty tomb, was the stone in front of the empty tomb, was it one guy inside or an angel or 2 angels? There's a lot of discrepancies between the Gospels there.
But the resurrection is all consistent. there was a resurrection.
They are consistent in broad scope, but when it's the finer details that are problematic. And I think we would all, I think all of us would agree that they definitely have differing finer details, which is I don't have a particular issue with. But I mean, when I was Christian, I would have quoted Mike Lacona when he said, "If we were back there when Jesus was resurrected, I'm pretty sure we would not have seen the zombies."
So it's a good point to transition. And first, I want to say thank you so much for our debaters, both our Daniel and our Lions, who have been asking great questions, getting us to think big time. And we just really value the diversity of thought here. So the thing I value, and I mention it at pretty much the end of every show, is that we disagree and we're tolerant. And better yet, I think tolerant, I've always thought, is just such a low standard. I think that you could, in a way, say that we're at least acquaintances, and in some cases, a lot of times we become friends, even in disagreeing. It's a lot better, I think, than merely tolerating somebody. That's like, think of how offensive that is. Like, I mean, imagine if that was in common, like, yes, Jared, I tolerate you. Like, it just sounds terrible. So we're picking it up, and we're going for friendship. So thank you guys, for real. All of your questions, all of your answers, everything. And then thank you for everybody in the audience for asking your questions. Really interesting questions, thought-provoking. Thank you for being here. I want to mention Gray Skeptic. He mentioned he's got a response video for Jonathan Sheffield's video. So Jonathan, you've already got another lion out there in the real world coming at you. And so that'll be an exciting thing. Everybody's channels are linked in the description. So I highly encourage you, check out Christopher, check out Jared, check out Red, or whether their channel or their Twitter, and check out Jonathan, whether it be his channel or his original video. And I just want you to be able to get, like I said, straight from those people what their views are. And last, I want to say Jonathan at Anchored Alliance Evangelism is having an after show. Highly encourage you to check that out if you can. And then all the debaters, you'll be invited. If you have to go to bed, so I know for some of you it's midnight, I totally appreciate you staying up so late for that. Like, this has been, honestly, I've gotten such a kick out of this. This is super interesting to learn. So as mentioned, go ahead, Jonathan.
And I have said this to, because even though I'm going on my ongoing debate with Richard Carrier on his blog, I have asked him and other atheists to come on there and challenge me. Even though we're talking about the reliability of the New Testament as it relates to the last 12 verses of Mark, atheists are more than free to come out and challenge. I am trying to do my best job responding to all questions on his blog as well, relating to the reliability of the New Testament.
That's awesome. Well, that's awesome. Glad you're very responsive and engaging with people. Excellent. And yeah, as mentioned, after show. So if you want to talk more about both the content of tonight and continue the conversation, Jonathan at Anchor Alliance Evangelism after show. And thank you all for tuning in, especially for the debaters for putting in their hard study work and their time tonight. So again, thank you very much, debaters and the audience, for your questions. Keep sifting out the reasonable from the unreasonable, and have a good night.